Security is a trade-off, not an absolute. Opening, setting the stage. Let's begin with a question that sounds almost offensive in its simplicity. What does it mean to be secure? Ask that to someone who has never worked in cybersecurity, and they will say something like, "It means nobody can get in." Ask it to someone who has spent 20 years in the field, and they will pause, exhale slowly, and say, "It depends on what you can afford to lose." That distance between those two answers is where all of security lives. It is not a wall you build once and then forget. It is not a product you buy, install, and check off a list. It is a negotiation, every single day, between what is theoretically possible to protect and what is practically possible to implement given your budget, your team, your technology, and your business requirements. Security is a trade-off, not an absolute. That is the single most important idea you can carry into any security conversation, any architectural decision, any interview room, and any boardroom. The moment you accept this, you stop asking, "Are we secure?" and you start asking the right question, which is, "Are we making the right trade-offs?" This session is entirely about understanding that idea at every level, from the theory to the implementation to what breaks when someone gets it wrong, and finally to what it looks like when someone gets it spectacularly right under pressure. The foundation, what risk really means. Before we can talk about trade-offs, we have to talk about risk. Not the word, but what it actually contains. A risk is not the same thing as a threat. A threat is something that could harm you. A vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited. Risk is the intersection of both. The likelihood that a specific threat will exploit a specific vulnerability, combined with the impact it would cause if it did. Here is an example to make this concrete. Imagine you leave a window open at night. The open window is the vulnerability. A burglar in the neighborhood is the threat. The risk is shaped by how likely that burglar is to walk past your street, notice the window, and decide your house is worth entering, multiplied by what they would take if they did. If you live alone in a studio with nothing of value, the risk calculus is different from someone living in a large house with a safe full of jewelry and cash. Security professionals work with this every single day. And the central challenge is that you cannot close every window. There are too many of them. Some of them you cannot even see. And some of them, if you close them, the house gets too hot to live in. Now let's talk about what you actually do when you find a risk. There are 4 options, and every single one of them involves accepting some kind of loss. The first option is avoidance. You decide the risk is unacceptable and you eliminate the activity that creates it. A company might decide not to store payment card data at all, handing that entire process off to a payment processor. The risk disappears because the asset disappears. The trade-off is that you lose flexibility. There are things you could have done with that data that you can no longer do. The second option is mitigation. You reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk by implementing a control. You deploy multi-factor authentication to make credential theft harder. You segment your network to limit what an attacker can reach after getting in. The trade-off here is cost, complexity, and friction. Every control costs money to buy, time to deploy, and effort to maintain. Some of them slow your users down. Some of them break integrations you depend on. The third option is transfer. You shift the financial consequence of the risk to someone else. Cyber insurance is the most obvious form of this. You are not eliminating the risk. You're not even reducing it. You're saying that if it materializes, someone else will help cover the cost. The trade-off is the premium you pay and the fine print you must understand deeply, because insurance does not cover losses caused by your own negligence. and defining negligence turns out to be a very interesting conversation. The fourth option is acceptance. You look at the risk, you calculate the cost of treating it, and you decide that treating it costs more than the risk itself is worth. This is not laziness. This is a legitimate business decision. The trade-off is that you must document it, own it, and revisit it when circumstances change. A risk accepted 2 years ago by someone who has since left the company with no documentation is not risk acceptance. It is a governance failure waiting to be discovered in a post-incident review. Understanding these 4 options is the foundation. Every security decision you will ever make is one of these 4 things, or some combination of them. Your job is to be able to articulate which one you chose and why. The CIA triad, where trade-offs live every day. There is a framework so foundational in information security that it predates most of the internet. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The CIA triad. You will be asked about this in every foundational interview. But the interesting question is not what each one means. The interesting question is what happens when they conflict with each other. Confidentiality is the property that ensures information is accessible only to those authorized to see it. You protect confidentiality through encryption, access controls, and least privilege. If no one who should not see the data can see it, confidentiality is intact. Integrity is the property that ensures information is accurate and has not been tampered with. You protect integrity through checksums, digital signatures, immutable logs, and version control. If the data you're looking at is exactly what was stored and nothing has altered it in transit or at rest, integrity is intact. Availability is the property that ensures authorized users can access information when they need it. You protect availability through redundancy, load balancing, disaster recovery planning, and backups. If the system is up and responsive when someone legitimately needs it, availability is intact. Now, here is where the trade-off becomes vivid. Consider an emergency room in a hospital. A patient arrives unconscious and the doctor needs their medication history right now. Strict confidentiality controls might require multi-factor authentication, a supervisor approval, and a 30-second delay. In that moment, availability and speed of access take absolute priority over confidentiality. The system is designed with a break glass mechanism precisely because the designers understood that a security model rigid enough to block legitimate emergency access is not secure. It is dangerous. Now flip that. Consider a defense contractor storing classified weapon specifications. Availability is important, but it is never more important than confidentiality. It is acceptable for an engineer to wait an extra hour to access a document if that wait comes with airtight verification that they are who they claim to be. The trade-off is explicit and intentional. Integrity sits in its own uncomfortable position during incident response. When a server is compromised, the instinct is to restore it immediately, to get it back online, to recover availability. But the moment you restore that system from backup, you may be destroying forensic evidence. The choice between restore now and preserve evidence first is a direct conflict between availability and the integrity of your investigation. This is why incident response frameworks explicitly say, contain before you eradicate and preserve before you restore. The CIA triad is not a checklist. It is a tension triangle. Your job is to understand which vertex your specific situation demands you favor, and to be able to defend that choice. Zero trust. The trade-off taken to its logical extreme. If the CIA triad gives us the vocabulary for trade-offs, then zero trust architecture gives us the philosophy taken to one of its most demanding conclusions. The core principle is 5 words: never trust, always verify. What does that mean in practice? It means that no user, no device, no application, and no network location is ever trusted by default. Not the CEO's laptop, not the server sitting inside the perimeter firewall, not the administrator who has worked there for 15 years. Every single access request is evaluated against a set of conditions. Who is asking, from what device, from what location, at what time, to access what resource before a decision is made. This sounds like the right answer, and in many ways it is. The reason Zero Trust emerged as a serious architectural model is that the old assumption that everything inside the firewall is safe collapsed under the weight of reality. Attackers got inside perimeters through phishing. Insider threats existed. Contractors with broad access overstayed their welcome. The perimeter, it turned out, was a fiction. But Zero Trust is not free. The trade-offs are significant, and they are worth naming clearly. The first trade-off is user friction. If every access request requires verification, users experience more friction. Push notifications, authentication prompts, conditional access policies that block access from unmanaged devices. These create frustration. Some users work around them. Shadow IT is born almost entirely from security friction that feels unreasonable. The second trade-off is architectural complexity. Implementing an identity-aware proxy in front of every internal application requires those applications to be cataloged, categorized, and integrated with a policy engine. Legacy applications were not built for this. Some of them cannot authenticate to a modern identity provider without significant rework. The third trade-off is operational risk during rollout. When a large financial organization rolls out Zero Trust and enforces identity-aware proxy policies, some internal applications become unreachable. Not because the security is wrong, but because the policy did not account for service accounts, machine-to-machine communication, or legacy trust relationships that were implicit and undocumented. The engineers assumed every access request had a human identity behind it. Many of them did not. Diagnosing this kind of failure requires working through several layers. First, you check whether a policy exists for the affected application at all. Many failures during Zero Trust rollouts happen because applications were simply not included in the policy engine, and when the default deny kicks in, they silently fail. Second, you check device posture. If the application is being accessed from a device that does not meet the posture requirements, the access is blocked at the device layer before it even reaches the application. Third, you look at service accounts and non-human identities. Machine identities are one of the most overlooked categories in Zero Trust implementations. A service account that was previously trusted because it originated from a subnet inside the perimeter is now being evaluated individually, and it has no MFA, no certificate, and no posture signal attached to it. The point is that Zero Trust is not a product. It is not something you deploy on Tuesday and celebrate on Friday. It is an architectural philosophy that demands a thorough understanding of your environment before you begin enforcing it, and a willingness to accept temporary pain in exchange for long-term trust hygiene. Tools and the trade-offs they carry. Every security tool is a materialized trade-off. Understanding a tool deeply means understanding not just what it does, but what it costs to use it and what you give up when you deploy it. Consider a next-generation firewall with deep packet inspection enabled. What it gives you is extraordinary visibility. Every packet that crosses a boundary can be examined for malicious content, application layer anomalies, and policy violations. What it costs you is latency. Deep packet inspection takes time. For most applications, this latency is imperceptible. For a high-frequency trading firm where microseconds determine profit, it is existential. The control that protects most organizations can cripple this one. The trade-off is not hypothetical. It is architectural. Consider multi-factor authentication using FIDO2 hardware keys. This is among the strongest forms of authentication available to enterprise users. A hardware key cannot be phished. It cannot be intercepted via a man-in-the-middle attack. It cryptographically binds authentication to a specific device. What it costs is procurement, distribution, and replacement logistics. Every new employee needs a key. Every lost key needs to be revoked and replaced. Every device that cannot accept a USB or NFC key needs an alternative solution. The security benefit is enormous. The operational overhead is real. Consider a cloud-based SIEM. The value proposition is clear. Ingest logs from everything, correlate events across your entire estate, detect threats that individual tools would miss, and support compliance reporting. What does it cost? Cloud SIEMs charge by data ingestion volume. Organizations that enable verbose logging, which is exactly what you want for thorough threat hunting, face ingestion costs that scale rapidly. The choice of what to log and what to suppress is not a technical preference. It is a financial negotiation. And every log source you decide is too expensive to ingest is a blind spot you have accepted. Consider data loss prevention. DLP is designed to prevent unauthorized data from leaving the organization. It watches outbound email, file transfers, USB activity, and cloud uploads. When it works correctly, it catches an employee accidentally emailing a spreadsheet containing customer PII to a personal account. When it is misconfigured or overly aggressive, it blocks a sales executive from sending a product brochure to a prospect or prevents an engineer from uploading code to a shared repository. The productivity cost of false positives erodes trust in the tool. Users learn to work around it. The control that was supposed to protect the organization becomes a source of shadow behavior. These are not arguments against using these tools. They are arguments for using them with clear eyes. Every tool you deploy is a decision about which risks you are willing to accept in exchange for the protection you gain. That is the trade-off in action. Implementation, where theory meets reality. Let us move from concepts to implementation, because this is where the trade-off gets personal. Imagine you are asked to implement an account lockout policy for a company of 500 employees. The security requirement is simple. After a certain number of failed login attempts, the account locks. This prevents brute force attacks from systematically trying every possible password against a set of usernames. But what are the thresholds? If you set the lockout after 3 failed attempts, you will create a denial of service vector. An attacker who knows a list of usernames can deliberately trigger lockouts across an entire organization right before a critical business process, a board meeting, a trading window, and end-of-day reconciliation. The security control itself becomes a weapon. If you set the lockout after 20 failed attempts, you have given an attacker room to run a very effective low-end slow credential stuffing campaign. A reasonable starting position is between 5 and 10 attempts, with a lockout duration that is sure enough not to cripple productivity. 15 to 30 minutes for automatic unlock, but paired with alerting that flags rapid lockout events across multiple accounts as a potential attack signal. The lockout policy itself is only one layer. The alert on pattern of lockouts is the detection control. Neither one alone is sufficient. Now consider implementing SSL inspection at a web proxy. You need to inspect HTTPS traffic for malware. But HTTPS is encrypted. To inspect it, you must perform a man-in-the-middle decryption. The proxy terminates the TLS connection from the client, inspects the content, and re-encrypts it before forwarding to the destination. This gives you visibility. It also means you are breaking the end-to-end encryption promise that TLS makes to users, and you're handling the decrypted contents of every HTTPS session your employees make, including their banking, their medical portal, and anything else they access from a work device. The trade-offs here are layered. From a security standpoint, you gain visibility. From a privacy standpoint, you have created significant liability. From a user trust standpoint, if employees know their HTTPS traffic is being decrypted and inspected, some will feel surveilled. From a compliance standpoint, depending on your jurisdiction and industry, decrypting certain categories of traffic may itself be a regulatory concern. The answer is not to avoid SSL inspection. The answer is to implement it with a clearly defined bypass list. Banking domains, healthcare portals, legal services, documented in a policy that employees can read, approved by legal and HR, and log in a way that shows the inspection is for security purposes and not surveillance. The control is the same. The governance around it is what makes it defensible. The pattern holds everywhere. Implementation is not just the technical act of deploying a control. It is the process of understanding its side effects, documenting its scope, getting organizational alignment on its trade-offs, and building the adjacent controls that address what it cannot do. When trade-offs go wrong, the troubleshooting lens. Understanding trade-offs in theory is one thing. Recognizing when a poorly understood trade-off has created a problem is a more demanding skill. Let us work through several scenarios. The first scenario involves MFA rollout and token synchronization failures. An organization implements multi-factor authentication for remote VPN access. Shortly after launch, the help desk is overwhelmed with calls. Users cannot authenticate. Their tokens are being rejected. The immediate assumption is user error. But the volume is too high for that. Something systemic is happening. The root cause in many such cases is time drift. TOTP tokens, time-based one-time passwords, generate codes based on the current time combined with a shared secret. If the clock on the authentication server and the clock on the user's device are not synchronized, the generated code and the expected code will not match. Even a drift of 30 to 60 seconds can cause failures. The fix is to ensure that your authentication server is synchronized to a reliable NTP source and to configure your TOTP implementation to allow a tolerance window of 1 or 2 intervals. The deeper lesson is that time synchronization is a security dependency that is easy to forget. NTP is not glamorous. It is not in anyone's vulnerability report. But a drifting clock can break authentication across an entire organization. The second scenario involves password complexity policy and its human consequences. Security policy mandates complex passwords, 14 characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters, rotated every 60 days. From a pure information theoretic standpoint, this is strong. From a human behavioral standpoint, it is a disaster. What actually happens when users face a policy they find unworkable? They write the password on a sticky note. They use a predictable pattern, Their password becomes Summer 2024 in June and Winter 2024 in December. They reuse passwords across their corporate and personal accounts. The policy designed to increase security has created exactly the vulnerabilities it was meant to prevent. The resolution is to shift from complexity toward length and password manager adoption. A passphrase of 4 random words is statistically harder to brute force than a complex 8-character password and dramatically easier for humans to remember. Pairing this with an enterprise password manager solves the memory problem entirely. The trade-off of requiring users to use a password manager: training cost, initial resistance, single point of failure if the manager is compromised, is far lower than the trade-off of a complexity policy that produces predictable passwords written on desks. The third scenario involves alert volume and analyst attention. A SOC manager discovers that a critical alert, flagging a host communicating with a known command and control IP, sat in action for 12 hours because it was buried in a queue of 4,000 alerts. When the incident is reviewed, it turns out the queue was dominated by alerts from a vulnerability scanner performing its scheduled scan of the internal network. The scanner generated hundreds of multiple failed login attempts, alerts per minute, because it was testing default credentials against every discovered host. This is a textbook example of alert fatigue, the trade-off between comprehensive coverage and analyst attention. The CM was doing exactly what it was configured to do. It was generating an alert every time the login threshold was crossed. The scanner crossed it continuously. The result was a denial of service against the SOC's attention. The fix involves tuning. You create an exception for the scanner's known IP range, specifically for the login failure rule. But you must be surgical. The exception must apply only to that specific rule, not globally to the scanner's IP. If you suppress all alerts from the scanner's IP, you create a blind spot for an attacker who discovers the scanner's IP and uses it as a staging address, knowing that traffic from it is ignored. This is the trade-off made visible in operational reality. Tuning to reduce noise is necessary. Tuning without understanding the attack path you are opening is dangerous. Every suppression is a hypothesis about what can be safely ignored. That hypothesis must be tested and revisited. The job role lens. How different roles experience this trade-off. The same trade-off principle looks different depending on the role you occupy. Let's walk through how 3 different professionals experience this daily. The security architect sits at the intersection of business requirements and technical controls. Their version of the trade-off conversation is constant. A business unit wants to move to a SaaS platform that will require sending customer data to a third-party cloud. Legal wants data residency in country. Engineering wants the simplest possible integration. Security wants encryption at rest, encryption in transit, DLP integration, and audit logging. These requirements are not incompatible, but they are expensive. The architect's job is to find the architecture that satisfies enough of each requirement to make the project viable, while being explicit about what is not being satisfied and what compensating controls are in place. When a zero-trust rollout creates unreachable applications, it is the architect who should have anticipated this. The correct approach is phased enforcement. You begin in monitoring mode, not blocking mode. You collect data on all access patterns. What services communicate with what accounts are accessing what, which machine identities exist, and where. You build a map of your real environment, not your assumed environment. Then you begin enforcing, starting with the highest risk, highest visibility applications. You measure the impact. You adjust the policies. You iterate. The architect who enforces zero trust across the entire estate on day one, without this discovery phase, is trading speed for reliability, and the reliability side of that trade usually loses. The security analyst and MSSP or MDR provider experiences the trade-off at the detection fidelity layer. They are watching dozens of customer environments simultaneously. Every alert that fires consumes analyst attention. An alert stream that is tuned too loosely generates thousands of signals per day, most of them noise, and buries the real incidents. An alert stream tuned too tightly misses genuine threats that don't quite match the signature. When a customer complains about too many low-priority alerts, the analyst's response must be structured. First, categorize the alert volume. What percentage of alerts is coming from which rules, and what is the true positive rate of each category? Second, identify the tuning lever. Is this a threshold issue, an exception list issue, or a fundamental mismatch between the detection logic and the environment? Third, propose specific changes and quantify their impact. If suppressing a particular alert category reduces volume by 30%, but has a true positive rate of 0 in the last 90 days, that is a defensible suppression. If it has a true positive rate of 5%, that 5% needs to be caught another way before the suppression goes in. The SOC analyst at L2 and L3 level works to the sharp end of this trade-off. When an alert fires for multiple failed SSH logins, followed by a successful login from a foreign country IP, and the user says they were not traveling, the analyst faces a decision tree under time pressure. The trade-off here is investigation depth versus containment speed. Every minute spent gathering evidence is a minute the attacker, if real, has on the network. Every containment action taken prematurely risks disrupting a legitimate user, creating operational impact, and eroding trust in the SOC's judgment. The disciplined response is to run a parallel track. Initiate soft containment, block new connections from that IP, reset the session, while simultaneously querying logs for what that account has done since the successful login. Correlate with HR data. Was the user traveling? Check device logs. Was the SSH key they used issued to their known devices? Build the narrative before escalating. The escalation to a manager or to the customer should come with evidence, not just an alert notification. The common thread across all three roles is the same. The trade-off is not a problem to solve once. It is a condition to manage continuously. The tools, the thresholds, the policies, and the playbooks all decay. The attacker adapts. The business changes. New services get deployed. Old controls lose relevance. What was a good trade-off 18 months ago may be an exploitable gap today. Case scenario: the high-frequency trading firm. Let us close with a scenario that illustrates every concept we have covered, placed in a context where the stakes are high and the trade-offs are unforgiving. You are a security architect brought in to secure the internal communications infrastructure of a high-frequency trading firm. The firm executes millions of trades per second. Their competitive advantage lives in microseconds. A trade that takes 1 microsecond longer to execute than a competitor's trade is a losing trade. Latency is not a performance concern here. It is an existential business concern. You walk in with a standard security architecture in mind. Mutual TLS for service-to-service authentication. A next-generation firewall with deep packet inspection at every zone boundary. A SIEM ingesting full packet captures for forensic fidelity. You present this architecture. The head of engineering puts down his coffee and says, simply, no. Not because security does not matter, but because the latency introduced by TLS handshakes at every service call, by DPAC inspection on every trade order, by a CM that must process and store the volume of telemetry this network generates. All of that compounds into a latency penalty the business cannot absorb. This is the trade-off in its purest form. The security architecture that would be correct for a hospital, a bank, or a government agency is architecturally incompatible with this business model. So what do? First, you reframe the problem. You're not being asked to not do security. You're being asked to do security differently. The constraint is latency. The goal is still confidentiality, integrity, and availability of trade execution. Second, you redesign with the constraint honored. Instead of active inspection at the packet level, you deploy passive, high-speed network detection and response sensors on mirror ports. NDR does not sit in the traffic path. It observes a copy of the traffic. Latency, near zero. Visibility, substantial. You lose the ability to block in real time at the packet level, but you gain the ability to detect and alert on anomalies without touching the production traffic path. For east-west traffic between trading services, you implement strict network segmentation at the hardware switch level using VLANs and hardware-enforced access control lists. No packet that does not conform to the allowed communication matrix can traverse the segment. This is not as granular as MTLS, but it provides network-level isolation without the cryptographic overhead. For the administrative plane, the layer where humans configure and manage these systems, you apply full zero trust. Every administrator must authenticate with a hardware key. Every privileged session is brokered through a PAM solution and recorded. Just-in-time access means that standing privileged access to production systems does not exist. An administrator who needs to make a configuration change requests access. It is granted for 30 minutes. The session is recorded and it expires. The trade-off here is that getting into production systems is slightly slower for administrators. That is an acceptable trade-off because administrative access is infrequent and the risk of a compromised admin account with standing privileges is very high. Third, you document every decision as an explicit risk acceptance. The absence of real-time packet inspection is not an oversight. It is a documented, signed decision that acknowledges the residual risk and specifies the compensating controls that replace it. If something goes wrong later, the organization can demonstrate that they understood the trade-off and chose it deliberately rather than stumbling into it. Fourth, you build a review cadence. This architecture is reviewed quarterly. New attack techniques against trading infrastructure are evaluated against the control set. If a new attack vector emerges that the NDR sensors cannot detect passively, the trade-off calculation changes. Perhaps a targeted active inspection on a specific protocol becomes warranted even with some latency cost. The threat model evolves. The architecture must be permitted to evolve with it. The outcome is a security architecture that the business can actually run on. It is not the most secure architecture theoretically possible. It is the most secure architecture that the business can implement, sustain, and operate within its model. And it is documented with enough rigor that every choice can be explained, defended, and revisited. That is what it means to treat security as a trade-off rather than an absolute. Closing, what you carry forward. Every time you sit across from an interviewer, a board, a business stakeholder, or a junior analyst, and someone asks, "Are we secure?" You now know the right answer is not yes or no. The right answer starts with, "It depends on which trade-offs we have made, whether they were the right ones for our risk profile, and whether we were still comfortable with them today. Security is never finished. Every control has a cost. Every uncovered risk is a decision, sometimes deliberate, sometimes accidental, to accept exposure. The professional who understands this does not chase the fantasy of absolute security. They build a discipline around making defensible choices, documenting those choices, measuring their outcomes, and revising them when the world changes. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability will always be in tension with each other and with business objectives. Risk avoidance, mitigation, transfer, and acceptance will always involve giving something up. Zero trust will always be harder to implement than it is to describe. Tools will always have side effects. Users will always find the path of least friction. Attackers will always find the trade-off you forgot to make explicit. Your job, in every role, at every level, is to stay in that tension thoughtfully, not to resolve it, not to escape it, to manage it with discipline, transparency, and intellectual honesty. That is the practice of security. It was never about building an impenetrable wall. It was always about choosing which walls to build, how high to make them, and what you were willing to place on the other side.